Ladies and gentlemen, great turnout. Delighted to have you all with us today. I don't know everyone here, not least as we've got quite a few guests joining us this morning. We've got our members here, which is fantastic. But given the topic that we're discussing today, exiting the echo chamber, opening up political discourse, we are also delighted to welcome here students from the Cedar School in Croydon and All Saints Catholic School in Dagenham, as well as a lot of our, the shout out, somewhere here. Oh, well, that's good. Okay, we get some applause for the shout. And we've also got a lot of our undergraduates who are the ones who started applauding, probably. Again, all of our members. And I'm delighted we're here because we've wanted to be able to have, for some time now, a conversation that really goes a little bit underneath the headlines that we tend to deal with here at Chatham House. We've had a huge number of impressive political leaders come and speak here, but what we've not really had the time to do is to dig below the surface and try to sense what has been driving this growing polarization in politics, in particular in the West, though there's some manifestations of it as well internationally. And so on exiting the echo chamber, opening up political discourse, what we've done is taken the opportunity of a visit here by Andreas Dracopoulos, who's co-president of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and Ron Daniels, who's the president of the Johns Hopkins University. Both here because we are in the process of opening up the Stavros Niarchos Foundation floor at Chatham House, which is a new space where Chatham House staff, guests can really do new types of work, new ways of thinking about the international relations challenges that we work in each of our areas of research. And so having them here, and polarization has been a little bit of the issue that I'll explain in a minute. Ron and Andreas have been trying to get more deeply under the surface of. That's going to be the theme of this conversation today. We're taking advantage of them being here to do that. And we have two other colleagues here, Shaista Aziz, who's joined us, who is a political commentator, journalist, occasionally stand-up comedian. So I'm not going to ask you to stand up. You could be sit-down comedy today as well. Beware. And my good friend, not Sophie Walker, who is sick today, in case people were expecting to see her. But luckily, I have Patricia Lewis, who in America, you would say, can be a utility infielder on moments like this, but not least... Sorry, I'm the comedian. Oh, I'm the comedian. So we're going to have a conversation amongst the four of us here about this issue of political polarization. Now, what we've thought about a little bit here is, how do we structure a conversation of this sort? Polarization in politics is interdisciplinary. It's going to require an understanding across a whole range of disciplines of research to be able to understand and to be able to manage more effectively. Ron, president of the Johns Hopkins University, you, with the support of the SNF, are setting up the Agora Institute on polarization. What are the drivers? And I suppose you're combining, as I understand it in here, issues of psychology, obviously politics, history. There's a whole range of disciplines that you would normally contain within a great university like the Johns Hopkins University. And as I understand it, you're bringing them together under one roof to try to understand what are the drivers of this new phenomenon that I suppose we try to use as a general explanation for a Brexit decision that no one expected in the United Kingdom, certainly not many people in the press and the betting houses, etc. A win for Donald Trump, which again was unexpected by most people. A surprisingly good showing, even though not a win, in France by the Front National, the National Front party there. A general sense of a sort of a collapse of established politics. As you've gone about setting up this institute, what do you think some of the main drivers are from your experience, I presume, in the US, but I know that you've done work and traveled all over the world. Maybe you're picking up these themes from other parts of the world as well. What do you think some of the big drivers are? And let's just get your impression first. I'll move down through the group, do a couple of questions, and then get all of you involved in this conversation. Ron, first, welcome to Chatham House, I should add as well. I think your first time here. Over to you. rarely get applause before you speak at Chatham House. So this is really, everyone's in a very good mood this Monday. So go ahead.
So thank you first and foremost, Robin, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be here as part of this panel on a very important set of topics. So I think the starting point is even to provide some description of the phenomena we're talking about. You know, what is this polarization? Why is it that we're so concerned about it? I'll talk principally about the United States, but I think, of course, as you've indicated, Robin, this has implications throughout the developed democracies. And something that, as you indicated a moment ago, that Andreas and I have been concerned about for a few years, but this past year or so, we really decided to bear down and to do something about it. So in the context of the United States, what are we talking about? What we're talking about is increasingly a society that is deeply fractured around political lines. It is a remarkable transformation that we've seen in the United States. But what has happened has been that the Democratic and Republican parties, which for a long period of time were somewhat inchoate in terms of their ideological identity, have now become deeply, deeply different from one another. And so what you see is there was a time where you would find middle-of-the-road Republicans that sometimes would vote Democratic. Similarly, with Democratic voters, sometimes going to the Republicans. What we're increasingly seeing is that degree of overlap becoming less and less marked. And so that the parties have started to stratify in very significant ways. And that, of course, has implications for the kind of policy you develop, where, as you had experienced in the UK with these wild swings through the 70s and 80s, going from one economic policy, from nationalization to privatization, back and forth, you're starting to see the same tensions in the United States where there is a growing extremism in the positions that are being marked out. That's one dimension of it. But in fact, it even goes beyond simply what is being manifested by the national parties. And that is that you're increasingly seeing American citizens essentially saying that they don't want to interact with, they don't want to live side by side with people of the other party. And so this idea of the great sort, which has gotten attention over the last 10 years or so, where you will find Democrats clustered on the coast, in enclaves where basically they're going to the same schools, or the kids are going to the same schools, they're socializing in the same venues. They're basically in their own little clusters in the same way that Republicans are also clustering in Middle America in much the same way. So this is just, again, fostering this degree of isolation from one another. And again, this, of course, has feedback effects into the political process. It goes even beyond that. Whereas in the past, Democrats and Republicans would look at each other's policies and say, of the others, they're misguided, they're wrong. We're now finding in the polling that the members of each party are describing their opponents in moral terms. It's not just that they're wrong, they're selfish, or they're seeking to inflict harm on the idea of America. So there's now this sense of even this moral opprobrium that is feeding into the situation. And one of the most remarkable things that has been documented in several polls is that this kind of antipathy to one another that one sees in the United States, Republicans against Democrats, is now even expressed in terms of each, the members of each party increasingly expressing chagrin about the possibility that their children might actually marry someone of the opposite party. So what you're seeing is this deep level of fragmentation in the United States, and that in turn just creates this deep polarization in the political process. It gives rise to very nasty politics that are highly symbolic, focusing on minorities, fear of immigrants, populist national policies, economic policies, a deep level of resurgent nativism. So all of these things constitute a very poisonous brew for the country, and something that, again, we're trying to think about ways in which you can start to ameliorate this.
Now, just maybe follow up on one point with you, because if you're going to ameliorate it, one has to, I presume, have a sense of some of the key drivers. Is this an all of the above problem? In other words, it is partly the insecurity created by globalization. Is it as much the ineffectiveness of government, maybe the Iraq, Afghanistan wars, the way they panned out, the global financial crisis? Is it about social media? And that's driving maybe a polarization that was always potentially there, but is now being, drawn out. I mean, I'm going to ask everyone this question, but if you could just give me a sense quickly here, what would you pick out as the one or two key drivers why this is happening now in America?
So I think it is all the above. I would add cable news to the mix. We're now seeing very clearly in the last election that as much as we talk about social media, the fact was cable news, and in particular Fox, was a much more important determinant of shaping political discourse in the United States. But I think this issue that we are all grappling with across the industrialized democracies and of the effects of globalization, but driving technology in particular and loss of jobs, I think is creating deep anxieties. And I just would add to the mix on this that the effects in the United States, and I think as is true of other countries, but particularly in the United States, of the Great Recession and the massive loss of wealth that occurred during that Great Recession, in the sense that 25% of the country, this is amazing, 25% of the country lost more than 75% of their wealth in the Great Recession. So just the magnitude of that concentrated loss, and particularly on lower and middle class Americans, the rage that, that accompanied that, in the sense that at the same time that happened, TARP took care of the financial institutions. And so the sense, again, that there's just grinding inequality, significant risk of job losses, and a sense of deep despair that is growing up in America.
Okay, right. So some important themes to have on the table to start this conversation. Shaista, let me come to you now. And I mentioned earlier, done a lot of writing for Guardian, for a number of the Global Mail, New York Times, etc. You've addressed these issues of divide. And also, I think you presented, because I say this is not just a UK perspective, you've traveled all over the world. You presented the BBC 3 documentary, A Nation Divided, on the Charlie Hebdo aftermath. And I think you traveled around some of the French banlieues and some of those more deprived areas. What do you think, is there a global phenomenon, a Western phenomenon? What's driving it? Is it about identity? Is it about economics? Where would you start with this big question?
Well, I'd say it's all of those things. The number one underlying issue is inequity, which has just gone, it's rising every single day. Our country is one of the most unequal countries in Europe. Estonia is ahead of us, then comes our country, which is quite breathtaking. We are one of the most unequal countries in the world, in the developed world as well. How has this come about? It hasn't happened overnight. There's been continuous attempts to sort of suggest that this neoliberalism and trickle down, all of that's going to work. It hasn't worked. It was never going to work. And now we are where we are. And then if you throw into the mix the rising unemployment, issues around identity, issues around race, these are things that nobody really wants to talk about, particularly in Britain. I think in the US, clearly there is a developed discourse around race in a way that we don't have here in our country. And then the biggest elephant in the room is class, which is never addressed ever in our country. And I find a lot of the commentary around what's going on, particularly post-Brexit, and Grenfell as well, quite ridiculous, to be honest, because there's a lot of discussion and a lot of use of this word shock. This is shocking. We didn't expect Brexit. Brexit was a shock. Trump was a shock. Well, who was it a shock to? That's my question. I don't believe it was a shock to minorities. If you look at the trajectory that led to Trump getting into the White House and also Brexit, it was very clear what was going on. There was a developed discourse which is all about alienating people, pitting people against each other, narratives around immigrants and imagery, very disgraceful imagery around these hordes of Muslim-looking people coming towards our island, all of that. Now, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens when institutions are failing to do what they're supposed to do. And one of the main institutions, which I'm part of, is journalism and the media. And you talked about cable news. We can also sometimes laugh at the likes of Fox, but let's look at CNN. I worked for CNN myself in Pakistan as a CNN news producer. They have very robust journalistic standards, I'd like to add very quickly. But they went on record to say every time they put Trump on in the run-up to the US election, their ratings went through the roof. And I feel that a lot of what's going on has become entertainment. There is nothing entertaining about what's going on. We've got rising levels of hate crime here in the UK and in the US. We have to ask ourselves, how have we got to where we've got to? And part of the issue is around identity and now who actually gets to define who is an American, who is a Brit, who is a European. I'm British, I'm European, I'm Muslim, I'm a woman. I have multiple identities. You can't ask me to choose which one of those I want to be more aligned to, but that's exactly what's happening. You mentioned Charlie Hebdo, just very briefly. 2 years ago, I travelled around Paris, making a documentary for the BBC. It was made in the space of 4 weeks. Usually it takes 6 months to produce a documentary like this. We got amazing access. We interviewed the new Charlie Hebdo editor. We interviewed Marine Le Pen. Great access, okay? But the premise of the documentary was to find out what it means to be young, French and Muslim in France post-Charlie Hebdo. Obviously, we know there's been other catastrophic terrorism attacks in France and elsewhere. And the thing that really, really struck me was that there's an entire generation of young French Muslims. They are French, born and raised in France, but they're rejected as being French. And it's not them doing the rejecting, it's the state doing the rejecting. And the thing that will always really stay with me was in the process of doing these interviews, every single day when I was out and about, I'd be asked this question continuously: what is your origin? Where are you from? What is your origin? Where are you from? And I was thinking, well, if I'm walking down the street, can I not just pass off as a French, citizen, a Muslim? And so I did ask a few people. I said, well, why can't I just, am I not French? Can I not just pass off as French? And I was told, no, because you're not apologetic. You're too confident to be a French-born citizen who is Muslim. And I thought, well, how damning is that? How devastating and how damning is that? And what does that tell you? That tells you everything. And this is the situation that we're in. And I do feel that for a lot of young European Muslims, and I've spent a lot of time traveling and talking to a good few numbers of young European Muslims, we don't have an identity crisis. We are very clear that we are all these things and more. And we're deemed to be suspect until we prove otherwise. And so we've got into this situation where we cannot expect social cohesion and all of that if a group of people are deemed suspect unless they prove that they're not. And what kind of message does that send to young people? Prove your allegiance, prove your allegiance. This is psychologically very damaging.
Now, just to come back to you on one of these points, because you raised, and I'm sure you raised economics, you raised the issue of neoliberalism. Let's just park the economics for 1 minute and focus on your last point about identity. You said you're very comfortable having multiple identities. Is part of the polarization then between those who are comfortable having multiple identities and those who say no, in a way you have to have one identity to belong to something?
I mean,
now, is that a feature of the UK, do you think, as well? Is that France? Is this ubiquitous now in the West?
I think it's definitely a British feature. I mean, not so long ago, Theresa May said you're a citizen of nowhere if you believe that you belong everywhere. And part of the problem is that we as British people are not comfortable with our past. We never have been. We have never, ever really come to terms with the whole notion of empire. It's not taught in our schools, it's not taught in our universities. Anytime there is any attempt to open up discourse, to open up academia, it turns into like a free-for-all on the cover of the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail. In fact, 2 weeks ago, Cambridge University, one of their students happens to be of Nigerian heritage, ended up on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. She was accused of pretty much trying to, bring down the country because the students there are trying to decolonize the curriculum, which is absolutely what should be happening. And what they did was they picked on a hyper-visible young woman, a non-white woman, and framed the entire discussion around decolonizing the English curriculum, pinned it on her. And I have lost count of the number of young women, in particular Muslim women, that I've met who are engaged so deeply in our country's politics, who want to be involved in the political system. I met one yesterday, and do you know what she said to me? She said, my family are terrified for me. I could never try and get into politics. And I said, why not? She said, they're worried about the backlash against me. They're worried about me being splashed across the newspapers. They're worried about me being questioned. And it goes on and it goes on. And this is definitely happening, and it's happening in our country.
So we end up potentially in a situation where not every, at a time of polarization, not everyone can then be involved in defining the terms of the political debate, because certain people just don't get involved. So those who are left involved perhaps are those with the most convinced views. Let me keep moving around the panel. Andreas, Stavros Niarchos Foundation, one of the world's leading philanthropies, established in 1996. It works internationally. I know you give grants all over the world, but obviously based and started in Greece. And I wanted to get your sense of how polarization looks from, you live in New York as well, so it's maybe a little unfair, but how it looks from the Greek perspective. Because here's a country where a political party, Syriza, actually got into power, demolished the traditional opposition of the left, the Socialist Party there, was able to take power, seen as quite a radical move, but I suppose if we look back just over a few decades, Greece has gone through a lot before. We've had dictatorships. It's still a relatively young, new democracy, even though a very old democracy. How do you see this process of polarization? What's driven you and the SNF to want to support the Agora Institute? What do you think some of the main drivers are here of polarization?
So, first of all, thank you for having me here today and my colleagues. I think it's important to think about Greece polarization. It's almost part of the Greek DNA. If you go back thousands of years, we grew up with the whole issue of polarization, mainly politics, but also in the socio-economic world. It's interesting because I've lived more than half my life in the US, and it's interesting now in the last 2 or 3 years. For me, I was like almost saying, so welcome to polarization. It was like the US was not ready for it. They thought it's like, it's so perfect, we're never going to have it. So I think Trump and the whole scene around Trump in the last 2 or 3 years has really evolved, and now you are seeing the whole discussion about polarization. It's interesting because I think people talk about the fake news, and I worry a lot more about polarizing news, because fake news, eventually, by being fake, you will figure them out. Polarizing news are the ones that really go under the skin, and I think are becoming part of the long-term problem. Then to look at it a bit on another view, people say a bit of stress is not bad. It's actually good for you. So I think a bit of polarization is not bad. But where we are going now, we're going where every single discussion is polarized from the beginning. I think labeling has a lot to do with it, and I start to worry about labeling the word polarization itself. What does it mean? We're putting everything under this word, which is true, but we have to be careful that we don't become basically a prisoner of the word polarization. And what exactly can we do about it? And again, I think a bit of it is not bad. I think a lot of it, which is what we're seeing today, is bad. So I think the whole effort was, with Johns Hopkins and with Ron, to try to first establish a space, and then knowing that it's not a science, we're never going to figure out the ultimate solution, but if possible, improve the situation, even have the people get together. We talk about civic engagement and civil discourse. And the notion of civil discourse, which sounds so obvious, it's not obvious. We don't have civil discourse. Forget the civic engagement. So going back to a bit of the old plain values of engagement, of doing it in a civil way, I think are very important. The difficult thing is, how do you implement it? So I think that's where we're in the process now with Ron, trying to find the best possible way, and that in itself will be an evolving process.
You said that, that's an interesting phrase, a bit of polarization isn't bad. And I must say, in the United Kingdom, people were struck the extent to which young people really got involved in this last snap general election in ways that people maybe had thought they might be more engaged, well, they were pretty engaged, in the Brexit debate that had preceded it. But there was something about what Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, has offered. It's a sort of purer, cleaner version of a different political view. In other words, there is a distinctiveness between the two that is being drawn out as part of its value. So do you think it's almost important that there be some clearer defining lines between political parties in order to give a voice to different viewpoints? You know, you've had now Syriza in government for a while in Greece. Is it able to survive, and are the other political parties regathering around different narratives, or are they all still trying to fight for the middle ground? Because I must say, in a lot of Europe, the middle ground became where politics happened. And once it all became about the middle ground, people lost their connectivity. So
talking about how we label polarization itself, I believe that up to a point, politics, media, academics, in many ways, they sort of, people in those areas, at the end of the day, use themselves polarization. And again, what exactly do we mean with it? But it's, so everybody has become part of it, and in many ways, part of the problem. And I think that's why you have to actually step back and go back to the basic values. Let's simply talk about it and do it in a civil way. And again, there's no final solution. There's no complete right or complete wrong.
Patricia, let me come to you now, Research Director of International Security, but also you are on the one of the co-directors of the big project we did on the Global Commission on Internet Governance, which you have a copy of, One Internet. And I thought maybe we could draw on, as we've covered quite a few of the political themes here, get a little bit into the digital space and whether this is driving whatever we want to call this phenomenon, polarization, to a negative extent, and whether it could even be used, I suppose, to a more healthy extent. What have you picked up about the way that access to digital information is changing the nature of political discourse in the West in particular, maybe globally?
Yeah, I would say, and here's a proposition I'd put forward, I would say that access and participation and content delivery is really important in the way the internet runs. And I was very struck by what you said about civility, and I would include the word respect in that. And I think that one of the things that happens on the internet, particularly in social media, but not only in social media, is that we're losing a lot of civility, just basic good manners, just basic respect for other people's views, for other people's ideas, and where they come from, etc. And this is the echo chamber effect as well, as you start to get this sort of manufactured outrage or, manufactured distaste that then quickly becomes disrespectful. So one of the things that I would propose is that part of what's happened is that the internet was devised by a small group of people with a particular worldview. And therefore, it's being created without consideration, if you like, of other ways of thinking and other ways of doing. So if we take the issue of women, for example, in developing countries, a woman is 25% less likely than a man to have access to the internet. Generally, there are still over 3 billion people who don't have regular access to the internet, and women will form a large proportion of those. And yet, take ourselves back, in the middle of the 19th century, the very first idea of a computer program was devised by a woman who lived just 2 doors down from here in St. James's Square. And later on, in the 1930s to 1950s, when electronics were giving us new capabilities in computing, It was women who were the programmers. They were the creative drive behind it. And then it all dropped away in the 80s. Now, why is that? We don't really understand. There are all sorts of really brilliant research projects on this. But the truth is that what's happened is that women have not formed the drive, haven't been part of the drivers and the content providers for the internet. And I think that this has created an internet that is not women-friendly, and that's one of the things that we have to change. And if we change that as well, I suggest we change it as well by including people from different viewpoints, from different economic strata, from different countries, and we really generally fill out what's called the multi-stakeholder governance process for the internet.
But are you saying, therefore, that men are the polarizers?
I wouldn't just say men. I would say there was it was a group of men from a particular part of the world with a particular viewpoint. I wouldn't want to give the whole gender.
Those are the nice California guys who are meant to be
They're wonderful California guys, but we all have our biases, we all have our views, and we build them into everything we do. So we're worrying now about artificial intelligence and the algorithms, and will they just reflect our own biases? The answer is yes. So how do we reduce bias? Well, we bring in people with different viewpoints, and we reduce bias that way. That is one of the ways to do it. So, I mean, it's not to be naive. I don't think that bringing in everyone from different walks of life, different genders, etc., will create a utopia. But I think it would be better.
Yeah. And how, just to be practical about it, as we're turning then to solutions, how would you bring in a more inclusive approach, therefore, to devising internet programs? Is it about media? Is it about programming itself? What's the differential?
Well, so here's an interesting, if you're a musician now and you go for an audition, you go behind a screen and you don't wear shoes. So that when you go in, they are not sure whether you're male or female. And what's happened is orchestras now are being populated by many more women. So when you take the names off the computer programmers, guess what? Women do as well, or even sometimes better than men. As soon as you put the names back on, guess what? The men keep getting chosen. So here's the thing. There are things that we can do to reduce the biases that would just give women a fair chance.
And therefore, as this is about polarization, and we're supposed to be talking about gender polarization here, but on the political side, is that the more inclusive, what are you saying that would be the change factor to try to get away from some of the negatives of polarization? Because if I can just take, Andreas said a bit of stress is good, a bit of polarization is good, but the word polarization implies poles apart, physically, yeah? So, on one pole, the other pole, you can't see each other, which is where Ron started off at the beginning. How does this aspect necessarily start to shorten the distances between those two poles? How does if you focus on the gender element, how does that do that?
Well, I think that right now what we see is a massive discrepancy in those that are driving content, driving programs on the internet. Yep. So if you just could reduce that substantially so that so women and men had equal chances of being able to shape and govern and run the internet, yep, I think that would make a big difference. Now, we'll always have a discussion between the sexes. That's always going to be the case. So I'm not worried about removing any debate at all. I think that it would change. I actually think that gender equality is a transformational principle. Mm-hmm. And I think if we had a world in which we had men and women running it together, and people from different ways of thinking running things together, we would transform the way we do things.
Ron, let me come back to you. We're just going to do about another 5 minutes, and then I want to get into everyone here. What would you put within the disciplines? Where are you going to focus first? Let's say you're setting up the Agora Institute. You want to try to get to the bottom of political polarization, social polarization that maybe is behind it. Is gender at the top of the list? Yeah, I mean, that's a little unfair to get you to pick one. But where are you going to put your effort? Where do you think the nearest term change agent is in terms of a discipline?
So I think it starts with us understanding in a much more nuanced way how people form their opinions and how you change their opinions. So I should say, at the start of the discussions that Andreas and I had about the need for some kind of intervention, I came to him with, I think, what in retrospect was a fairly naive conception of what we should be doing. That was, my sense was that the best way in which the academy could contribute to fostering dialogue across the different chasms in American society, indeed well beyond, was having a neutral place where truth, empirically driven claims by a neutral body would be able to shape the discourse and somehow find a way to bring the different groups together. And I think what's really striking is that as you look at the literature that increasingly is mounting about motivated reasoning, the inability for people to abandon their preconceived notions, what one finds is that this idea, again, quite naive, at just simply putting truth out there is going to be able to force people, pull people together. Disciplined debate doesn't work. So I think understanding how people form their opinions, but then more importantly, what works in changing opinions. Again, you know, what is clearly evident is that when people are now in these very different worlds, in these enclaves, Democratic and Republican, when the other party seeks to use facts, muster arguments to try and move people, it's not working. It's just, the positions are so deeply entrenched. So how we dig our way out of that, what are the processes, how you can actually restore some sense of a forum where the different estates, different stakeholders, different ideas conflict, coalesce, but at least with the possibility that you can bring people along, I think is a really important issue for us. And so I think that's top of the list, is really being able to probe and understand that. So then we can have evidence-based interventions that can start to pull people away.
I think it was Jonathan Swift who had this famous quote that you cannot reason a person out of something they were not reasoned into.
Right.
And therefore motivated reasoning, as he said, how drives it is going to be incredibly important. Shaista, when you made your opening remarks, you started off on the inequality issue. But let me just stick on the economics for a second. Do you think politics needs to go back to a more contested space of left and right? You know, redistribution versus the market. Do you feel that in a way we'd ended up with only one narrative working? Is that part of the answer?
Well, I think we're there already now in the UK. We have a very different. We have a socialist Labour Party in the true meaning of the word, right? And then we have a Conservative Party, which is the most right-wing Conservative Party, I think, in a long, long time. Many Conservatives don't recognise it. But there is definitely clear water between both of these parties. But that hasn't stopped the polarisation. That's actually, I think, made it deeper in many ways, because I think one of the problems is that nobody's listening anymore, actually. So when you talked about the young people coming out to vote during the snap general election, I believe this is the highest voter turnout for people under the age of 30. Yep. And the reason for this partly is because they know no one's listening to them. And they understand more than ever that they have to make people listen. And actually, some of them have given up on the political entities listening to them. They're just getting on with things themselves, which is what you're seeing in Grenfell, for example. It's the people who are busy trying to create a climate of restorative justice for the people in Grenfell. It's not the local borough, it's not the council that no one trusts, it's not the actual government. It's the people who are taking the lead. So I think I think in pockets people have started to understand that they themselves have power, and perhaps they gave away all their power, believing that our institutions and our political entities were actually going to provide all the answers. And now they're understanding that these people don't really have many ideas. Yeah. They're not going to find the answers. Just very briefly, during the snap general election, I spent a lot of time in chicken shops, fast food shops in Oxford, which is where I live, registering people to vote. I literally went out with my laptop. There was a big drive to register young people to vote. I had the most fascinating conversations. Most of them were actually with young men. They really wanted to vote. You know, they said to me, "This is the first time I'm going to vote. I've never voted before. Could you help me to register to vote?" So I just sat down with them. There were people from all walks of life, and I really felt I could tell very instantly that something has changed.
Yeah.
There's a change in the air. But then look at how these people have been dismissed by the corporate media, setups. Oh, these people don't know anything. They're naive. They don't understand politics. So this is the other thing that happens. Whenever people rise up and to reclaim their rights, they're constantly told, "Oh, you don't really know anything. What do you know?" And all I say is that I think this snap general election has fundamentally changed things in our country. I believe that this notion of understanding your power is the key to everything in terms of becoming. I think the thread in all of this is that being a citizen. And this question of being a citizen there's question marks placed on people who are other, who are different. You cannot be a citizen if you believe in this, if you believe in that. You can only be a citizen if you believe in this. This is complete nonsense. And it's something that is being challenged more and more by young people and by women. And just very briefly, I agree with everything you said about the gender disparity there. But I think the key to this as well is intersectionality. So it's not just men and women, or I don't think this is about men versus women or women versus men, but it's about who gets to be heard, who gets to be part of the political space. And actually, right over the last 4 weeks, the Me2 movement, as I'm sure everyone is aware of, where there's very powerful stories emerging of what people have endured in terms of sexual violence and abuse. This movement was set up 10 years ago by a black woman. It didn't get the same traction. It's got the same traction now because it's being led by white women, women with a lot of economic clout, women with high profile. So we have to ask ourselves why it is that we as societies choose to hear certain people and not choose to hear other people. And this is all part of the equation. It's not just about being a woman, it's about what type of woman, what type of economic power you have, what your race is, what your class is. And I think that the mainstream feminist movement is actually failing on this. It's still not there.
Andreas, let me come, because we'll come back to some of these points in a minute, both on the intersectionality you described, and also I think the question, and I'm just so people are thinking about this later on when we come to the Q&A, whether we can ever go back to the politics as it was, or in a way we're going to have to move to a more bottom-up approach, and I think this is what you were talking about here. It might be cities, it might be municipalities, or it might be citizen-engaged groups, it might be online, it might be physical. Andreas, one thing I wanted to bring you in on in terms of responses is that you've put a lot of effort into the idea of physical space as well. So for those of you who visit Athens next time, there is now the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Centre. It's a remarkable, it's got a park, there's a national library, there's an opera. But what was the thinking? It wasn't just about bringing that for Greece. I think I'm right in saying it's also about creating space for people to come together. So how important in today's world do you think physical space is for creating the room then to perhaps develop these crossovers? I mean, is physical space important?
I think physical and digital as part of space. You need the physical, you need the digital. Space is very important. Without space, again, whether it's physical or digital, you're not going to get anywhere. I think the big thing is to create the necessary trust, whatever this word also means, so that people can visit the space and feel that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And the same goes in a digital way. But with our cultural center, which we built during the crisis, and our big bet was that we're going to give it back, not to the Greek government, and that was a big thing. We're giving it back to the Greek society. And I think at the beginning, people thought that we were just crazy. You're giving it to the government. We tried to inspire the people to see it that this was actually theirs. And I think the big bet was won because from the beginning, thousands of people. I mean, you're talking about a country where the total population is about 11 million. In the last year and a half since it opened, more than 2 million have actually gone there. So they do see it as theirs. And I think that's the meaning of the word trust, that people actually believe that it was for them and there was no hidden agenda. It was built in a very transparent way, no hidden agendas, and the space is important on its own, but also because of the whole process behind it. And just a very quick comment, we're now in the process, and we're there in Athens now, of doing a new health initiative where we're going to build 2 hospitals and part of another 3rd hospital. And our foundation comes historically from the private sector. The government is, as you know, in Greece on the left or whatever. We're having an amazing collaboration, and it's all based on the coexistence, no hidden agendas, and trust. And we had a session with the 2 health ministers who basically said something which I thought was very, very important. They said, we do respect the foundation because they respected us. So it goes back to for me, trust and respect, they do come together. You can't have trust without having respect. So it goes back to the essential values of trust and respect to make the space be really trustworthy and work. Because you can make space, but if it's not trusted, people will not go to it, whether it's physical or whether it's digital.
Some important words cropping up here, which I hope we'll pick up on later on. Trust, respect, empathy, I would throw in. We've not brought this word yet, but I think it was a little bit what Ron was referring to earlier about the inability to see the other as with you. In fact, we've done some work at Chatham House on empathy and international relations, Matt Woolman and so on, wanting to work on this. However, I would also note we had our London conference at Chatham House recently where we talked about trust, and never have levels of lack of trust been as intense as they are right now in established institutions. So there's a long, long way to go, and maybe the kind of taking bottom-up ownership will have to be one of the ways of going there, because people don't trust the traditional institutions. Patricia, any last comment you want to pick up on here before I open up?
Yeah, I really agree, Shaista, with your point about the way in which movements get ignored until a particular group espouses them, and I think we can see countless examples of that.
I would say that, so in the intellectual discussions that we have here at Chatham House in our small meetings, one of the things that keeps coming up time and time again is what we call cognitive diversity. And what that means is different types of brains, different types of experiences. And this is really important. If you have a problem, bring together as many different types of brains. And that would mean people from different walks of life, but also people with disabilities, people as well who have mathematical brains or artistic brains, creatives. Bring in people from different ethnic backgrounds. Everyone has something new, and you get a different type of solution out then. And I would also add on that what you're also talking about is being safe and secure online. And people are not safe and secure online. Young people suffer very badly. People from different minorities get very badly treated. Women and men get very differently treated online. And I would say that this is, again, to re-establish trust in the internet is absolutely vital if we're going to find a digital space to be having these discussions. Otherwise, the internet is just going to be badlands for a few group of people who like shouting at each other, and it will become not very useful to the rest of us.
Wow, that's quite a vision for the future of the internet. Right, let me open up and get some viewpoints here, and I'm definitely taking some questions from this corner over here. So if you don't put your hand up, I'll pick on somebody, I'm warning you. So I'll take a question from the lady here first. I'll go to the young person here, there, here. Yeah, we'll take 3 or 4, and I'm going to keep track. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Federica Piazza from Prudential. I would like to ask, so we talk about the media and social media being a driver for polarization, but in the end of the day, what they do is mainly endorsing a political message that is channeled through a political campaign. In this sense, don't you think that political campaigning should be driven within a more regulated framework? Because by the time that things are fact-checked, actually they've already stuck deeply with people. So actually, this is why I think Brexit and Trump were a marketed success. So
you're saying it should be more regulated, therefore? Yeah. So because you can't keep up otherwise. That's your point, yeah? Okay. Young lady here, yep. Oh, yeah, 1, 2, yep. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And I liked the idea about identity, and I was just wondering whether a lack of fulfillment is maybe driving polarization, both lack of fulfillment of politics and life in general, and sort of bringing in mental health with that as well. Thank you. So
lack of fulfillment, yeah, in knowing what your future is, etc. Yep, please, microphone there. Yep, come in front.
Oh, sorry, I would like to address something that was said. So when you said that basically you said that about identity, and you also said that about the young people need to get involved as well. But I think because like young people lack confidence, even though they have confidence in friendship group, they lack confidence in society in general, because they feel like targeted. And I feel like the social media, like Twitter and stuff like that, give them confidence to speak out. Although that happens, but opinions are thrown around, and people lack their own opinion because they're not confident to research outside. And they also feel like politics is something for someone who works in parliament, or something that people who in the city think about it. It's not, for someone who's in Dagenham, like all of us, it's really rare to hear stuff like that. And getting involved is quite a courageous thing. So so we need to find a way to give confidence to young people to understand that politics is life. So anything we do is around politics, because politics is the sharing of opinions. So by giving confidence to young people like that would make participation and also political discourse to be rare in society. And I think because young generation is the future, and we need to realize that as well in society.
Thank you very much. Good point. Just be right at the front row, please, just here, because these hands take 2 more comments, and then we'll open it up. Yeah.
Thank you very much. John Warren, physician, Chatham House. In the 1950s, advertisers discovered they could make the case that tobacco is harmless, completely fly in the face of evidence, and those lessons have passed on to public relations and all aspects of public life now. Priti Patel's first major contract was working as a public relations officer for British American Tobacco, for example. How do we counteract the effect of advertisers and PR people in our national institutions like government and in the BBC, for example? There's an awful lot of money to be made out of polarization.
Very simple. A lot of money to be made out of polarization. And as we know, obviously, a lot of the growth of the internet has been driven by it's a form of advertising. That's why it's free. Gentleman just behind, one last one here. And then I've got lots more. I'll come to people. Yeah, let me just get...
John Halloran, European Social Network. My question is really about what we might, in a broad sense, call education. And I'd be interested in what the panel might think around both formal and a wider sense of education, and what role that could play. I'm thinking when people meet each other, often their relationship can develop in a way that is different from when you read about something or you see something in the media. And it's interesting that I know there've been quite a lot of evidence that those who felt most to fear, for example, from immigration, sometimes had the least experience of it. So, and I was wondering how we can do more in terms of our education, in a sense, both as citizens, but also in terms of as people grow up, so that people are enabled to make those kind of contacts, to actually become more aware of others, and to see themselves in other people's shoes. Is there something around our education system that can actually help to move this debate on?
Right, look, with a lot of points here. If I take 2, we'll go backwards and forwards quickly. So just some quick reactions. I've got lots of hands up, and I want to get points in. Ron, do you want to say something on education?
Yes. So let me start off on the education piece. You know, I think that one of the really interesting ideas that's out there in the United States is the revival of civics. You know, the sense that many people who are now in their 50s and 60s remember quite vividly having basic civics classes, a sense of American history, a sense of the operation of American political institutions, a sense of the American idea. That is, that this is not blood and soil, but this is an idea around the commitment to liberal democracy. And again, that one can maintain a number of different identities and still be a proud American. I think that for whatever reason, those classes have fallen into disuse, and I think there's a real opportunity to revive them and to see the extent to which you can start to mold, at least, a sense of commitment and understanding of the core democratic institutions. Let me, just also quickly react to the issue of fulfillment. I think that there's no question that there's a malaise and a sense of despair in a number of different pockets of America, and indeed internationally as well. What's remarkable is that if you look at the book that everyone was reading last year in the United States, trying to understand what happened in the election, it was Hillbilly Elegy, of course. is J.D. Vance's book on the alienation of the white middle class in the United States and the job losses and the despair that comes with that. In truth, that narrative tracks very powerfully the narrative that African Americans have been describing for generations in terms of what it means to suffer chronic, concentrated unemployment that now has an intergenerational character. So I think that there is a growing sense that economic pressures, and in particular, the loss of jobs and the lack of investment in retraining for people to get back into the workforce, I think is something that really does drive this issue around a sense of fulfillment. And I think to the extent that we see growing joblessness, a sense that the state has sort of stood by as these changes have taken place, in part because of trade liberalization, but mainly because of technology and the sense of displacement there. I think that's going to just continue to sow this kind of alienation, and this is where I think there's a lot of possibility for politics to make a difference in terms of the kinds of programs that enlightened governments can provide to insulate people from those vicissitudes.
Patricia, do you want to pick up anything on the internet in particular? There were 2 points there. Social media can't be fact-checked. Maybe needs to be regulated. There was the commentary as well about, the internet feeds off polarization, etc. What would you say on that?
I think in terms of social media and regulation, so there's a huge debate going on right now as to what sort of responsibility the internet service providers have, what sort of responsibility the social media providers have. Are they publishing houses and they have to be responsible for the content online? Are they enablers and they're just providing the infrastructure, and what we do online is up to us? So I think this is a really important thing. I think there have been some clear lines, but most of them have taken place after the impact of them. So, can you watch somebody murdering someone else online? The answer, I think, for everyone is no. But these, yes, but no, well, you should not be able to now, and things like that. So I think in terms of the rules of the road, the way people talk to each other, these are really important. You can report. So one of the things that the social media providers tell us is that people don't report enough, and they don't have trust that if they do report, that things will change. And they have said, look, this is untrue. Report, 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 and things will change. So when you see something that really upsets you and you see something that's disrespectful, report it. I think that's really important.
Yeah, come on in. Yeah.
Your point about the internet and we shouldn't be able to see someone being murdered is really interesting, because there has been a number of black African American men in particular who have been killed, and it's been filmed and it's been distributed around the world and everyone's seen it. So there's always a flip side to everything, which is what makes this so complex and not, for want of a better term, black or white.
Or we watch the targets as the smart precision bomb goes straight into the particular tank, but because it's the enemy.
So this is all part of the same dichotomy, isn't it? So yeah.
And do you just keep going? So I'll get you here, and I'll come to Andreas. On the identity, the confidence point. How do you share opinions in politics? Any comments on
yeah, well, again, I mean, we have to look at what we're doing to our young people. If we're demonizing them in terms of the language that's used around what it means to be young, this whole manufactured discussion about the so-called generational differences, these are not generational differences in terms of your grandfather owning a home and you never being able to own a home. This is catastrophic. This is an economic injustice, and this is how it works. I think we've got into a situation where the language that's being used, the words that are being used are not very truthful. That word truth is up for debate as well. It's the whole framing of it is very, it needs to be examined closely. And I think what I find in terms of spending a lot of time going into schools and talking to young people about what bigotry means, what racism means, is they have very clear ideas. They know what these things mean. They just feel they're not being heard. and that is a fact. So if you're used to not being heard, if you're used to being anonymous, if you're used to not being seen, why would you ever feel that there is a place for you in politics? Yet despite all of this, the number of young people who came out to vote swung this election, right? Just like in the US, 53% of white women went and voted for Trump. Because at the end of the day, everyone takes care of their self-interest groups. And you have to weigh up which one of those self-interest groups matters more. And I think that what's happening mostly in this country is a total underestimation of young people. There is some attempt to suggest this is a flash-in-the-pan moment. This is not a flash-in-the-pan moment. This movement, I believe, has to change and it will strengthen. But if you look at how grime music was used, how grime artists came to the forefront during this campaign, we talk about Twitter. There's a black Twitter, there's a Latino Twitter, there's Muslim Twitter, there's LGBTI Twitter. There's all these different types of Twitter that are being used by these different identity groups to talk about politics in ways we've not seen. And this is really exciting. It's just that it's not mainstream, which is why perhaps it's being ignored and perhaps it's not fully being understood.
Well, I think young people never want to be mainstream, by the way, but that's just one other side point. A bit of demonizing, like a bit of polarization, maybe is good. Andreas, do you want to pick up on any of these points?
Well, I think from all that we hear, there's a common denominator, establishing trust. I think it goes back to basically being trustworthy, and the responsibility of leaders everywhere, whether it's politics, media, academics, to really do the right thing at the end of the day and establish this safe environment, which is trustworthy, to bring people in so you can start this civic engagement and civil discourse.
Trust is earned, so we have to earn the trust.
Yes. That's for sure. Right, we've got a lot more hands going up, and I want to get lots of viewpoints in. I'll see how many I can get. First gentleman there, then I'm coming here, then here, and then there, So keep your hand up, please, if you could. Right, back, sweater. Go. We've got to get a little bit towards the back of the room. Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
Hello, Vincent Neat, member of Chatham House. Thank you very much for all your comments. I in this polarised world, consider myself to be somebody who is fundamentally sitting on the equator. And sitting on the equator in the UK, I'd be interested to know, I don't see that Jeremy Corbyn, as a response to Grenfell Tower, is an ending to polarisation at all, in much the same way as I don't see continuation of Theresa May as Prime Minister as an ending of polarisation. So where am I going to find, and when, how long is it going to take me to find a politician, at least in my country, who's going to help me navigate a way around this and end polarisation through the political system?
Okay, I'm taking 3 questions out the front here. Lady at the front, who I happen to know, and then 2 here.
Is this working?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Trisha de Borgrove, I'm a writer and Chatham House member. A couple of things that I wanted to direct to the younger women there is 2 things that for me I think are quick solutions to what we're trying to find. Is one, I lost my residency, this is a personal thing, in this country, so I had to take the citizenship test again. And actually it was quite transformative. And I was wondering, so it basically asks you all sorts of questions, but about the bigger picture of this country. I didn't feel I was a majority in this country when I took it. It was the minorities, it was the rights of minorities, how we function, how we own a pet, what we do in a post office, how the EU works. It was all these sorts of things. Would you at school be willing to have, maybe, because you have very full agendas, I'm very aware of that, 20 minutes a week on something like a citizenship class? Something you should, I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Secondly, very quickly, with you guys, the internet we all love, I as much as everybody else. My worry is that the internet's not encouraging us to build up institutional knowledge in ways that when we were at school, if we were looking for a particular piece of information that we needed, we would have to refer to a book. We didn't have any other way of doing it. But through referring to that book, we had to go through the book to find what we were looking for, which meant that we grew in terms of the things that we were learning. With you guys today, is there something, could there be an equivalent of that on the internet in terms of not just going for the quick Google answer? Are you finding ways of feeling that you're getting more knowledge rather than information? So questions to you guys.
I'll hand over the sharing next time. Right. Next person here, front. One more front here, yeah. I'm going to go over there.
Hi, thank you. Leslie Vinjamori, member of council here at Chatham House and also an academic at SOAS. I have a question. I want to come back to this question of education, and I guess it's specifically for you, Ron Daniels. It's an honor to have you here at Chatham House. My question is about the role of the university, and actually specifically in the U.S. context. Of course, we think about universities, especially in America, as being one of the most, if not the most important engines of social transformation and changing inequality. But I think the lens that we have watching, and I also spend a lot of time in U.S. universities, but watching what's happening in university life in the United States, it seems to be phenomenally charged politically. The tension between political correctness and free speech, the incidents of Middlebury at Yale, the stance taken by the University of Chicago. And I guess my question is, how does this, in your view, what's happening in America in universities on this question of polarization? Have you seen a dramatic change, say, over the past decade in terms of the ability of the university to actually change how students think, or are students becoming much more entrenched? And is it about polarization, or is it about something else?
Young gentleman there, yep.
Whoa, that's loud. I want to raise an issue on the education front as well. The gentleman at the front said it, that he thinks that education for not just politics, but general affairs of the world that should be brought in at early ages, and I believe that completely. I think that I'm a big user of Twitter, and a lot of people have been saying it across the room. I think that too many strong views are... Not strong views are shown on Twitter, because that's fair enough, but people change people's views on Twitter too easily. Not just Twitter as well. Like someone said, I think it was at the front, you said that about the black people being shot by the police. That is true. Like, that is terrible, fair enough. But also, that being put on the internet is the only thing that everyone sees. They don't see the great work the police do as well. They don't see the whole picture. I think that current affairs should be taught straight away so that everyone can see what the real picture is. We see, like I saw a video the other day of a police officer stopping searching and someone turning around, kicking them, getting on the floor and arresting them, basically. So the public person arrested yeah, it was amusing, but it was bad, and people don't see that side of it. And I just don't think that the whole world is in a blind eye of what's really happening because we don't share it to everyone quick enough. I think the reason for this is maybe the true powers of the world don't want the people to see. Maybe they don't want them to know how they could change it, or maybe they want to be in power for that reason.
Right, we definitely get that point. So these two gentlemen have been waiting very patiently here, and I'm going to two people at the back. See those two at the back there? Yeah. Yep, please, the two of you, whichever order you want to go in, as long as you're quick, because we're going to run out of time.
Thank you. I was John Culhane. I was wondering whether there were any useful lessons which could be learned from the polarization workshop we've been running in this country for many years. I refer, of course, to Northern Ireland. And one of the interesting things about the polarization or depolarization of Northern Ireland was the synthesis of the views of what are called the Cherubile brothers, of Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness. And as I say, I wonder whether there's any useful lessons.
Still fairly divided, but carry on. Yes, please, sir, quickly, and then I've got two at the back. Yep.
I'm Stephen Porter. I'm a new member. I fear that maybe the real reasons for polarization are much more trivial than these wonderful people have told us. That maybe in Britain and America, one of the great driving forces of polarization is boredom. Boredom with a particular type of career politics, which has become very standardized, and maybe people are trying to get entertained more in politics.
They're certainly getting entertained at the moment.
From Trump.
Right. So, yep, please, gentlemen there. Last question there, and then we'll be wrapping it up. Yep.
Hi, my name is Hamza, and I'm at Goldsmiths. I just wanted to ask whether you think the reason young people aren't engaged in politics and sort of are discouraged to get into politics is because everything we see in the news and the media is quite negative. It's sort of people are dying, no one's actually surviving. It really paints a negative picture of the world. And for me, it's a sort of thing where, for me to get involved in politics, just, I guess, walking out in the street, my mum would say to me, oh, like, be careful, you have a beard, like, just like me, maybe you want to trim it down a bit. If you're going to go to a meeting, make sure you look smart, like, she's wearing a hoodie now. Sometimes I do feel a bit out of place. And I think a lot of young people would agree with me and say that politics isn't the path they want to take because they don't want to be surrounded by sadness, essentially. So what do you think can be done to actually make politics a bit more lively, a bit more fun, if you like, if it can be?
Just pass the microphone along to the young lady there, and that'll be the last one. I apologise for all the other people. We've got to finish in 5 minutes. Yep.
My name's Naomi Potter. I'm undergraduate at the LSE. And I was just wondering if any of the panel members thought that there's anything about the relationship between political institutions and social media, and like in particular the two-party system we see in the UK and the US, and the sort of range of identities that you see represented in social media, and if there's a bit of an incompatibility there. Thanks.
Okay. Right. There's a lot there. You can't do it all because we should really, and that wasn't, I suppose, the idea was to be able to get through everything here. A lot of points raised. So I've got a little list here. If I think anything critical is missed out, I will let them go. Why don't I run down this way? Patricia, and let Ron have the last word, so you know what's coming up. In your turn first.
Okay, I mean, I'll start with Northern Ireland because I think it's one of the hardest things to talk about. And I think that there are huge lessons to be learned from Northern Ireland. You know, the various crises and, of course, in the ways that we've also worked together to solve them. I would say that the issue of civility and respect was critical. And every time that gets lost, we end up in trouble. And I would also say there's a great phrase that I think was used a lot, and that is agree when we can, negotiate when we can't. And I do think that that's a mantra that we should all adopt for everything. But I think that there are some lessons that we could really usefully learn. We need to go back. And then I would say in terms of getting into politics and negative image of politics and how to make it more I do think this is a huge problem. You know, I listen to everyone, my response is always, well, why don't you go into politics? Why don't you become a politician? And the answer is, I think for most of us, we look at it and we go, oh gosh, no, I wouldn't want to go near that. So if we're not going near there, it's not going to change, right? So I think the answer is get into politics and change it together, but change it collectively, and don't imagine yourself in a narcissistic way to be able to change it as an individual. You have to do it collectively.
And there's many different levels at which you can work it as well. Yeah. It doesn't all have to be national politics necessarily.
No, absolutely not.
Andreas.
But I thought this last part was my point also about engage. Yeah. We have to engage, and maybe one on their own cannot do it, but if you start connecting the dots and keep engaging, I mean, better things do happen. I think it was interesting, a lot of the questions had the answers hidden in the questions themselves.
I hope so, because we can't answer them all. So thank you for that. Shaista.
Well, some people say we get the democracies we deserve. So yeah. I think the point there is we are citizens, we should be active citizens. If we want change, then without sounding like a broken record, we have to be that change. We really, really have to be that change. And the final point I'd say is that I spend a lot of time going into schools, talking and listening to young people, and I always say to them, never know your place. We live in a country, our country is one of the most class-dominated countries in the entire world, right? From the minute you're born, you're supposed to know your place. Basic message is never know your place. Your place is everywhere. Make it your business to be everywhere. Please...
Well said.
Please do not allow anyone to tell you can't do anything. I understand how hard it is to be a young person right now. Really, I do, more than any other time. But you have a voice. We've talked a lot about social media. Use all these tools, but use them to create change. Be that change maker.
To the young people, do it now, because you won't be young forever.
That's a fair point.
That's one of the things, Andreas, we want to work on in the Agora Institute, see if we can get some answers on eternal youth.
Eternal youth would be good. Hold on, well, Patricia, you wanted to come in as well.
So it's just a quick, when you said, we get the democracies we deserve, I don't think we deserve this.
No, we don't. That's what I'm saying.
And so we're not getting the democracy we deserve. So how do we get the democracy we deserve? I think that's the question.
That's absolutely my point, that we don't, none of us deserve this, so we have to then turn it around collectively. It goes back to what you said, we have to work together. We have to find out what our strengths are as individuals and what our strengths are collectively, and build strategies to get this nonsense that we currently have. We need to just remove it. And I totally don't think we deserve this, to be very clear.
Right. Ron, what do we deserve?
Well, I actually think we deserve some more boredom, because I'm actually to the point about that the real problem here is that we've become bored and we needed some kind of excitement. I am positively exhausted by what we're dealing with in the United States. I mean, it's just, you just see there's this sort of frenetic quality. The tweets come out, then people are kind of consumed with the ramifications of that. And so this impulsivity and just sort of wild frenzy of activity that is shattering America is exhausting. So I welcome the prospect of a return to boredom, though I fear it might be a bit quixotic. Let me just quickly respond to some of the issues that were raised. You know, one on the two-party system and the barriers to entry. It's much worse in the United States than it is in the Westminster form of government that you have in the UK, and I'm a Canadian, we have back home. But you know, in the United States, there are just so many institutional barriers to a third party. And so although there are a lot of really interesting candidates out there, one in particular I'm very fond of, given the connection to Johns Hopkins, is Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York. He looked at this closely, wanted to run as an independent, saw that there was a really interesting mix there of being very progressive on social issues, but being conservative on financial, fiscal issues. And it just, in the end, he looked at it closely. The barriers to entry were so formidable, he just couldn't make a go of it. I think that's a real problem for us. On the issue of will there be some kind of political entrepreneur who will do something in terms of moving us away from polarization? You know, I think it's probably worth just reminding ourselves that despite the outcome of the last national election in the United States, you know, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, and she lost the Electoral College by 77,000 votes in 3 states. It was really narrow. So, you know, this is only to say that although the issues of polarization and fragmentation we're talking about are serious, and for a variety of reasons, in terms of the long-term health and robustness of democratic society, we have to worry about this. You know, I can imagine in the next election, maybe even in the midterms, there were some very interesting things that happened last week in the down ballot elections in Virginia and so forth. You know, if you have a different kind of Democratic candidate who doesn't fall into the traps of characterizing large swaths of America as deplorables, and is able to talk in a very different way about, you know, these issues of the economy and the way in which you can transcend race. That's not to say that you marginalize race, but it's only that you can put together coalitions where people across different groups see the commonality across the country rather than the differences. I think you could see a very different outcome, and I think that could be healing. And so, you know, I think that's a point of encouragement. Finally, on the university, it's a large and really important topic that I would welcome the opportunity to talk to you more about offline. But you know, I think that quickly at 2 levels. One, when you look at the issues around academic freedom and free speech, and these moments when speakers are being disinvited and there's an attempt to squelch debate on campuses, I think in some sense it goes back to this issue of civics. It is remarkable how dimly understood, even in really smart, sophisticated students that are coming to these universities, how dimly understood the case is for academic freedom. Why it matters, why in some sense we want to have this unfettered debate, however rancorous and painful it might be at times. There is a belief that in a democracy, that's an important part of the way in which we surface differences and resolve them. And it's remarkable. It's remarkable how when we just this past year, when we took the entering class and just started to talk to them about this, you could just see the lights going on, but no one had made the case to them before. And again, you know, to the extent that we're now seeing in the United States in particular, a growing percentage of young people expressing indifference to the value of liberal democracy and being open to authoritarian forms of government. I mean, this is, again, just another manifestation of how we failed as the elders of our society to ensure an understanding of the values and the core institutions which we have labored so hard to create, or our forefathers did. So I think this is not to say that there aren't imperfections in liberal democracy. There clearly are, but I think they go more to the implementation of the idea than the core idea itself.
Well, very good points made. I want to thank all of you who've stayed here as well, because we've gone way over time, and I'm sorry, I just thought we'd let it flow because it's been such a good, vibrant conversation. One thing I take away from this, just in conclusion, is that polarization obviously means very different things to different people. People walk through the door in different places of what worries them, what concerns them, but it is a general feeling of angst and frustration, which is very visible in the questions, as well as I thought the good comments from the panel. Second point, I thought there were some really important words that came up here that we need to think more deeply about, and they're complex for international relations think tanks, but trust, respect, empathy, that kind of creating the space to overcome some of the divisions is going to be as important as the divisions themselves. And on that point, I think we heard a great phrase here, I'm going to remember it, never know your place. That's a kind of, Chatham House can be revolutionary when we have comments like that coming out. And we have had one positive example. One possible example, Macron. Macron certainly didn't know his place in that sense. He decided, I'm going to, blow this up. A lot of people said it'd be impossible. He came from a fairly privileged background, but on the other hand, he certainly overcame some obstacles to create it. So change at this moment of instability is definitely possible. So for the young people here, in particular, as I think Patricia and everyone was here was saying, and I think you said, Andreas, grab the moment, do it now. Now is the time to do it. There will be, and we look forward to the work of the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. I'd say at Chatham House, we're trying to get our own staff a bit more integrated, and the new SNF floor at Chatham House gives us a chance to be interdisciplinary in ways that we were not before. So we're all trying to think about different ways of working, and I would just do a quick call out for a new Chatham House project we'll be launching on the future of European democracy. If you can't get democracy right in Europe, where else are we going to get it right? And how can digital and technology help rather than be the problem? Let me apologize for all those people whose questions I didn't take. There were several hands, and I know some of the people personally, so I'm very sorry about that. But there's no favorites, as you can see here at Chatham House. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for great questions. Thanks for all the students who've been here. Big hand for our panel.